Good afternoon. When I was first invited to give this talk, I was a little nervous at the setup because they usually slot, a nice drab conversation right after lunch to put everybody asleep. But hopefully that won't be the case. And if what I saw in the silent auction is any indication, the number of bourbon bottles over there is pretty impressive. So, anyhow, I want to thank everybody for not just for the invitation, but for listening today. I'm going to present a bit about the fourth National Climate Assessment, but also get into a much broader discussion of some of the advances we've done since the third National Climate Assessment in 2014. So an overview of the talk is here, and again, one thing I do want to say is if you have any questions, you'll see some of my contact information on the last screen. Please don't hesitate to find me later today or elsewhere. This forum might not be the best for an interactive discussion, but we really want to produce a national climate assessment that's going to be useful to you all, as opposed to simply a platform for academics to promote their own research. And I think you'll see a lot of the things that we've been doing are hopefully going to help us achieve that objective. So a brief background or primer on the U.S. Global Change Research Program. It was established as a presidential initiative back in 1989 and solidified into law a year later. And it was really intended to help the nation understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced processes of global change. And every time I talk to my mom or my grandma and they say, where do you work? They say, oh, global change. Like, global change is everything. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, in a sense, yes. But I think it's an important point to highlight kind of the multi-stressor aspect that we're trying to take on here. And obviously we could not do this without the work of the 13 member agencies of USGCRP. I won't enumerate them all there. But there's kind of the natural ones that you would think, like the NASAs and the NOAAs of the world, but also maybe some less traditional actors like the State Department and AID and others that are more on the downscale user end of the system as opposed to the upscale or upstream side of it. The National Climate Assessment is a congressionally mandated endeavor, and I'm sure to reiterate that at every talk I give these days. And it's intended to be a quadrennial assessment with three main components. The first is to really kind of evaluate, interpret, and present to the nation the findings of the program over the past 4 years. Over time, that has evolved into a much broader synopsis of the state of our knowledge. Secondly, we are mandated to cover how global change is impacting a number of sectors, which you see in the second bullet there. And third, we to look at not just kind of the observed and the present conditions, but also predict out both on multi-decadal and end-of-century timescales. So the National Climate Assessment, we've done 3 to date, which if you do some math real quickly, you see that we were established in 1990. We have a quadrennial mandate, and we've produced 3. We're not quite meeting the letter of the law, but we're getting there. The first one was done in 2000, the second in 2009, and then the last one, which really represented a sea change in the way we did things, was released in 2014. And it again is really has evolved to become not just a federal exercise, but really a strong collaboration with a number of non-federal partners. So what we're doing now for NCA4 is building on the success of NCA3, and as I mentioned, what happened in NCA3 was a real sea change from how things had been done before, and in large part that's because of the vision of folks like Kathy Jacobs, Jerry Melillo, Tony Genados, and a number of other folks that played leadership roles there. There were a few key components that really made that a success. Won't go through all of them, but one of them is stakeholder engagement. As I mentioned earlier, we want the NCA to be a tool, not just a communication and education piece. And the way it's going to be a tool is if we actually, produce something that is responsive to the problems that people are trying to address. And so a robust strategy for stakeholder engagement is critically important. Clear communication principles. I used to work at the State Department, where I led our engagement in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is basically an international effort similar to the NCA. And everyone there always talked about, wow, you know, the US NCA is so accessible, the language, the website, everything they do is really what we should aspire to do. But of course, if anybody's ever tried to get consensus with 200 countries, you tend to muddy the waters a little bit. So, so again, really trying to maintain that, that high bar of communication. And the third thing I want to focus on is the transparency of our process. We did shift from a process that was led by a federal advisory committee last time to one that is overseen by a federal steering committee. And so for those of you who are not feds or not familiar, that single word may not seem like a big difference, but shifting from a FAC to an all-fed thing has enormous implications, which also means that we needed to double down on our engagement with the community this time around, and you'll see how we've been doing that. So pivot now into what's going on with NCA4. I kind of mentioned the first couple pieces on the process point. I should point out we've got, you'll see on the next slide, about 28 chapters, about 300 authors, about a 50-50 split between feds and non-feds. But on the substantive side, we've done a couple of things. We've really worked to implement what we're calling a sustained assessment framework, which has been part of the lexicon of USGCRP for a while now. And part of that has been the development of the climate science special report in advance of the NCA itself. Last time around, they were produced in tandem, and it produced some difficulties, because really what you want to do is get a sense of the science first and have that updated science inform the impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability aspect, which is what the focus of the NCA is on. Secondly, we have a much greater focus this time around on regional chapters. What we've learned is that when you're talking about impacts, when you're talking about vulnerabilities, when you're talking about adaptation, it's really site-specific, it's really place-based, and what we wanted to do was to bring forward a lot of the great things that are happening at the local level onto a national platform so we could learn from one another and hopefully build community resilience more broadly. Two other things. One is on the risk-based framing. I think that'll resonate with a lot of folks in this crowd. We've, the National Academies did a workshop last year on characterizing risk and climate assessments, and that has really helped inform how we're guiding the authors this time around. And finally, the bolded point there, a variety of new tools and information, and that's where the bulk of the talk we'll get into in a little bit. Briefly, though, this is the table of contents that resulted after a Federal Register notice last summer seeking public input. We've got 15 sectoral chapters, those national overviews, 10 regional chapters, and then 2 response chapters. Highlight just a couple of things. We've got new chapters on air quality, given a lot of the advances on the air quality and climate change nexus that have been revealed over the past few years. The final bullet on the left-hand column on climate effects on U.S. international interests is really responsive to one of the big gaps that was identified last time around, and we'll focus on things like supply chain vulnerabilities, national security, humanitarian response, that sort of stuff. The really long title at the top of the second column sort of comes out of the food, water, energy nexus chapter from the last time. To take a more holistic look at a lot of the integrated assessment modeling community and what they've been doing. But again, the big focus will be on the regional chapters, and we've done 2 big things. The first is to split out the U.S. Caribbean from the Southeast chapter. So Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands will have its own chapter. And the reason for that was really twofold. The first was because, you know, the islands obviously face unique vulnerabilities and have unique capabilities to respond as opposed to the mainland, but also the hope is that we can use this as a bit of a diplomatic entree into the rest of the Caribbean to help build vulnerability assessments throughout. And then the other big change was splitting the Great Plains. I think you may have seen in one of the plenary sessions this morning a figure of the NCA regions from the last time around. And you had that Great Plains region that extended from the border of Canada down to the Gulf of Mexico. And I think folks felt that, well, maybe North Dakota and Texas experienced different things. So So briefly, the national chapters, again, they're going to be short on the order of 6 pages. The intent is really just to give a snapshot and then really direct the reader to a lot of other resources that are going on. It'll contain a background or state of the sector, regional roll-up, what are the common themes across the regional chapters that make it into a national session. And then really each chapter will be focused around key messages. Again, that's consistent with how we did things in NCA3, so you'll have a high-level statement with some supporting text below that, really identifying what are the things that sector or region values, how are those things at risk, what are the challenges, opportunities, and risks associated with that impact, and then finally, what are some actions that are being taken. Now, it's really important to keep in mind that the NCA is a policy-neutral document, and so we need to thread that needle to be sure that we're not being policy prescriptive, and one way to do that is to really highlight some success stories, and that's exactly what we're hoping to do. The regional chapters, on the other hand, as I mentioned, will be much longer, about 3 or 4 times in the length, and highlight a lot of the actions that are going on the ground. Really, you'll see in a second, we did a lot of regional engagement workshops with the big objective being to bring about case studies, make the authors aware of things that are going on in small municipalities that they may not otherwise be aware of. This is our timeline. I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight most importantly here that all dates are subject to change. But this does give me great pleasure to at least in theory, illustrate that we're about halfway through the process, even if the bulk of the work is yet to come. But right now, we're basically in the stage where the authors are producing their first full drafts. Those drafts will be due to us at USGCRP in mid-June. They'll then go into review into the interagency process. And then this fall, if we stay on schedule, the report will be released for public comment, as a lot of these USGCRP reports always are. Simultaneously, it'll undergo a rigorous review from the National Academies or the National Research Council, if you're familiar. And then 2018 will largely be a response to comments and kind of a production phase, and with a view to releasing it in December of 2018, again, to fulfill that quadrennial mandate. So briefly on engagement, as I mentioned, stakeholder engagement is really critical to the success of the NCA4. Back in September, some of you may have participated in some background webinars that we did to really introduce the community to NCA4 and how it differs from the last time around. And over the past couple of months, especially in February and March, we conducted a series of 10 regional engagement workshops that really were intended to bring stakeholders to the table with 2 objectives. Really, 1, to inform them about the process, and then 2, to really solicit input from them to build out the author team's expertise to drive it towards a useful product. We also continue to do sector-specific stakeholder outreach via webinars. We've got a couple, I think, next week on air quality and the forest chapters, but we've done them for coasts, oceans, health, and so on. And you can take a look at our website, which you'll see plastered throughout this this talk. We've gone to events, major conferences over the past 6 months, really trying again to engage different stakeholder communities, different communities of practice, so to speak, to really hear what they want out of NCA4. Many of you, hopefully, your organizations are members of the NCANet, which was spawned during the last NCA, but is really a network of now about 200 organizations that really just come together right now every other month to kind of hear about what's going on with the NCA, but as it gets closer and closer to rollout, the hope is that folks will be interested in developing derivative products, help get the word out, and so on. So if you're interested, please check out the website there. And finally, of course, for anybody that does follow the Federal Register, we do continue to post notices in there. We've done 3 to date on a variety of aspects. We've got 1 in development now that will be an open call for review editors. So if you're interested, please keep your eye open. This is basically a map of where we've hit so far in the U.S. just in the past couple of months. The big green dots are kind of the hub locations for the regional workshops that we did. The little green dots are the satellite locations for those workshops, and the yellow dots are other conferences or events where we've given talks and or held listening sessions. And you can see that we're so far pretty pleased with our geographic extent, and a huge piece of that is the support and interest of institutions across the board, whether they're NGOs, private sectors, university, or other federal entities like NOAA's RISAs or the DOI's Climate Science Centers, USDA's Climate Hubs. They've all been instrumental in making sure that this is a success. So big thanks to everybody. Here's a number of ways that folks can engage in the process. I won't go through all of them here. The most important one probably is the one that says follow NCA4 specific news. So if you go to globalchange.gov/NCA4, you'll basically find everything you need there. And if anybody will be at the National Adaptation Forum next week in St. Paul, we will have both a public listening session on Monday, May 8th, as well as a more structured session on May 9th. So with that, I'm now going to pivot towards kind of away from the NCA4 itself and more towards some of the new tools that have been developed in part to help realize this vision for a sustained assessment, and really hoping that we can make the NCA more of a dynamic resource as opposed to this static thing, and to really achieve the main objectives of the program of advancing science and informing decisions. So the sustained assessment process has a number of components, and we continue to articulate a very clear vision. We have both a federal advisory committee under the auspices of NOAA to help with that, and we also have an interagency process to really help articulate that vision. But one of the key components of it, no matter how it unfolds, is traditional sustained assessment products. And over the past couple of years, we've released a couple of them. USDA led a report on climate change and the food security and the U.S. food system. EPA and Health and Human Services led a climate change and human health report that was released just over a year ago. And there are 2 reports in progress right now, one on the state of the carbon cycle, and one, as I mentioned earlier, on the climate science special report. But in addition to those traditional assessment products, the agencies have developed a suite of novel assessment products, so to speak. They're enumerated there. I'll go into each of these in a bit more detail in the next couple of slides. But again, the hope is to make the NCA more of a dynamic resource, so more of a toolkit as opposed to an encyclopedia. The first is the Climate Data Initiative. You go to climate.data.gov. You can have access to over, hundreds and hundreds of data sets. And the intent there is really to kind of leverage and hopefully compile in one place the government's extensive collection of climate-related data, and to stimulate efforts towards preparedness and community resilience. And also make it really just publicly accessible. You saw especially with NOAA and NASA and USGS with the release of the Landsat information a couple of years ago was obviously a windfall for many folks in terms of developing new products. We also have indicators. So basically, what are indicators of physical change in the Earth system? So on our website at the bottom there, you have 11 of them. They're mostly national in scope and annual in time scale. But they largely track change, observe change in a variety of physical systems, and will be updated routinely. At a more detailed level, EPA has a collection of much more localized and focused and region-specific indicators that might be of interest as well. If you go to epa.gov/climate-indicators, you can still have access to those. But the hope is that the authors will, basically embed hyperlinks and other resources to allow users to, especially when you're looking at it online, to be directed towards these other resources as needed. Another huge advance was the development of these so-called LOCA data. I'm not going to try and describe what localized constructed analogs really are because, frankly, I don't understand it. But that's the beauty of being a director of things. You just present one slide and hope others can talk in a bit more detail. What I do know is that they do provide downscaled projections of 40 different climate variables across the U.S. At a 1/16th degree spatial scale. And so they've done this basically by looking at an ensemble mean of 30 models under a variety of different future greenhouse gas emission scenarios at 3 timescales into the future. And I just showed 2 different examples there to give you a selection, both on the left-hand side, what could be an indication of energy demand in the future under a high warming scenario at the end of the century, and on the right-hand side, even under a low warming scenario in the middle of the century, you're going to get an extension of the growing season, basically across the board. In addition to the CDI and the indicators and the LOCA data set, NOAA back in January released updated sea level rise projections. These are downscaled projections all across the coast, providing both global and regional projections through the end of the century. And it's not just looking at CONUS, so our friends in Alaska and Hawaii, and even the U.S. Caribbean have information at their disposal. And valuably, this doesn't just look at kind of the typical drivers of sea level rise being thermal expansion and ice sheet melt, but it also looks at other factors such as changes in the Earth's gravity from ice melts, land uplift or subsidence. If you go to the folks in the Northwest, they'll talk to you all day long about how all it takes is one bad earthquake that is long overdue to really render a lot of their sea level rise information obsolete. And related to those sea level rise projections, and you can again take a look at the website at the bottom there. You can access a much longer PDF report that articulates a lot of this. But they looked at coastal flooding. So looking at the recurrence intervals for different types of flooding events, and you can see basically in these two plots of different scenarios that moderate flooding is basically projected to occur sometime in the next couple of decades for the majority of U.S. coasts. So it's certainly an issue that is being realized already in a number of places. I was in Charleston last week. And the sunny is no longer just a South Beach phenomenon anymore. In addition to those sea level rise scenarios, we also, in part from folks at EPA and USGS, have produced population and land use projections through the integrated climate and land use scenarios data. You can see these are 2 different shared socioeconomic pathways, just a couple of different parameters to kind of constrain it. But you can see this is just pulled out from the Midwest, but we have it for all 10 of the NCA regions. So you can see both in terms of population and developed land area. This is kind of feeds into what can be accessed in a graphical form. You might not be able to make this out, but this is Kansas City. On the left, the greater Kansas City area. In 2010, you basically have, this is a plot more or less of housing density. On the left is basically the case in 2010, and you see what is projected under 2010 under the A2 scenario, which was basically slower economic growth but high population. With obvious implications for the things you all are concerned about. The next step is to do a bit more of a detailed analysis. This is all very new, and I just had this put together for this talk, but this again is kind of the broader Kansas City area. But you're not looking now just at housing density, but all type of land use projections under 2 different scenarios. So you can see again kind of the large expanse of and changes in land use associated with population growth and economic growth. NOAA has also, in addition to their sea level rise products, they've produced state climate summaries for all 50 states, and they're in the process of developing one for Puerto Rico as well. They've all been peer-reviewed externally. And again, part of this was to fulfill the demand from local and regional stakeholders after NCA3 for more granular level information. And you can access those at the stateclimatesummaries.globalchange.gov. Looks like the .gov got cut off there, apologies. But they're all kind of, they can download them in kind of, they're kind of 4-page glossy handouts that have a similar kind of format, a couple key messages associated with each state, a couple of consistent figures, but also if you go online, there's up to 1,500 supplemental figures. And here I just pulled out, I think it was for Iowa, observed spring precipitation as well as extreme precipitation events over the past century or so. So the state summaries, again, like I said, have key messages associated with them, and they are all, as you might imagine, region specific. So in talking about Missouri, it's obviously quite a bit of interest in heavy precip events, as well as drought. And so you see a couple of the figures that are kind of consistent across all of the states here. So if we kind of, if you've seen sort of this progression, what we started with were sort of more raw data, and we've sort of advanced to more sophisticated tools. The Climate Resilience Toolkit, unfortunately, just came in second place for a Webby Award last week to Uber, unfortunately, but nonetheless, the fact that a federal climate website rivaled Uber for a Webby Award is something that a number of folks are taking a great deal of pride in. But if you go to toolkit.climate.gov, you can access an array of not just raw data, but some really interesting case studies where different communities can learn about how they're building resilience. Look down at the county level with some really helpful interactive ways of looking at projections of temperature, precip, and a number of other climate parameters. So it's basically a collection of a variety of things. If we go further downstream, we've developed two other things as well. The first is the Partnership for Resilience and Preparedness. And this is a public-private collaboration to really empower a data-driven approach to helping develop climate resiliency in a variety of communities. And it's being led jointly by USGCRP and the World Resources Institute. And it's really basically a way of having facilitated dialogue, this is really a way of communities putting forward kind of the tools and the information that they use to make decisions. So each community that is a part of this basically puts up what we call a dashboard of different data, different information that they've used to make a decision. So you can sort either by region or issue that you're trying to solve and figure out what type of information you might want to use. And then related to that, but yet kind of further downstream, is something called the Resilience Dialogues. And this is, again, a public-private collaboration between USGCRP and the American Geophysical Union to really kind of facilitate dialogue among communities, between communities, to kind of go a step further than what PREP did, and not just kind of passively present the information, but to actively help communities work with one another. And this is still in early phases, but we've had a number of good collection of communities across the spectrum. So finally, I just want to kind of put this all in perspective of kind of a sustained assessment ecosystem. If you look on the left-hand side, you have much more of those kind of raw data and tools that we talked about. One thing I didn't mention is the Global Change Information System, or GCIS, but it's basically a transparency element that allows any user to track the provenance, the originality, the traceability of a given data that's been cited. And then as you move on into raw data, into refined kind of products and tools, into finally downstream a direct connection to decision makers. And the hope is that the National Climate Assessment will really run the gamut of a lot of that stuff to help facilitate informed decisions. So with that, I'll leave my contact information up there as well as the website. And again, just a huge thanks both for the invitation and for your attention. Thank you very much.